Jonah chapter 1. I'd say that's the wrong button. All right, Jonah chapter 1, verse 9. That's right. Just to recap from last week, this is where we are, okay, to put us in the story of Jonah. Most of you probably are familiar with the story of Jonah. So we're on a boat. We're in a storm. And the storm is so violent that these seasoned sailors, guys who had traveled all over the Mediterranean world, had seen lots of storms. They're shivering in their eye patches. Now, they probably weren't pirates, but in my mind, they're pirates because I like pirates. But this storm is not simply a meteorological phenomenon. It's a storm that is an obedient servant of God aimed at this one man, Jonah. And Jonah tried to bury himself deep within the cargo hold of this ship. In fact, the story tells us he was down there asleep. He was not just buried down physically deep. He was buried down in his own mind, asleep. And though he tried to bury himself, Jonah is brought out and discovered to be the cause of this storm, right? And the sailors, they question Jonah. They say, why is this happening? Who are you? What God you serve? Where do you come from? What is your occupation? They ask him these questions aimed at discovering his identity and the identity of the God who could bring about such a storm. So I mentioned this last week, that last week was kind of the first half of the sermon. If you were not here, that's okay, because there's plenty in this half of the sermon to tide you over. So that's where we are as we start this. They've asked him these questions, and verse 9 is how he responds. He says, he answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and who made the dry land. And it said, this terrified them. And they asked, what have you done? And then he adds in parentheses, they knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and then it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they couldn't, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So, I like TV. I like to watch TV. Some really memorable television characters actually started out as minor characters on their respective TV shows. I don't know if you know this, but several characters who we kind of associate with TV shows started out with the intent that they weren't going to play a big part on the show. For instance, Fonzie from Happy Days was just supposed to be a kind of a bit player. He eventually, obviously, got pretty famous. Steve Urkel from Family Matters. That's when I was a kid. I don't know if you guys remember that show. Steve Urkel was supposed to be just a minor character. From today's shows, Walking Dead, Daryl, if you guys like shouldn't be watching Walking Dead. Shame on you. Just kidding. Daryl's one of my favorite characters. Daryl was supposed to be just a minor character, has grown into one of the stars of the show. All of these guys were given really minor parts to begin with, but unexpectedly grew to play really big parts. The reason I mention that is because the same thing happens here to these sailors. To these sailors in the book of Jonah. If I were to ask you to recount from the best of your ability the story of Jonah, right? Especially if you've not read it for quite some time, if you were to recount the story, you're almost certainly going to mention God and Jonah and the Ninevites and the fish, but you might forget about the sailors. They kind of always play second fiddle to everybody else, and we expect these sailors to play a really small part in the book of Jonah, and we treat them as such. But what we find out, especially in this text, is that these sailors are important, right? These sailors are not just secondary characters to be thrown away or forgotten about. It would be very easy for, as the author of Jonah was writing this out, and as God was performing these things, for the sailors just to kind of be filler. Like these are guys that had to be there so the story could continue on. But instead, God treats them as his created beings. And so that's what we see this morning as we look at our text. So I'm going to go back and break it down a little bit at a time. Back to the beginning, Jonah's answered to them. He says, I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And it said, this terrified them. And they asked, what have you done? but that they knew he was running away because he had already told them so. Literally, when it says this terrified them, this literally says they feared a great fear. They feared a great fear. And even though they knew that this was what Jonah was doing, I don't think they ever understood the implications of what he'd said to them. Now, it seems to me that the narrator could have told us before that Jonah had already informed the crew that he was running away from God. It would have made more sense last week, right, when the storm started, that this might be the result of Jonah running away from God. Why do you have to cast lots if you've got a guy on board that's saying, I'm running away from God? Don't you just go to him to start off with, right? So why does the narrator not tell us until now that Jonah had already informed the crew he was running away from God? I think the narrator wanted to draw out the drama and reveal it at just the right moment so that we can see the sailors put two and two together. It's kind of revealed to us as it's revealed to them. One thing I've been trying to do is point out some of the literary genius of the book of Jonah. It's really a beautifully written book. And this is one of those places where you kind of push the drama till just the right moment. And so right now he lets us know that the sailors are figuring out that they're not dealing with something ordinary. They're dealing with something extraordinary. They're not dealing with one of their various local gods, right? They are dealing with Yahweh. They're dealing with the God of Israel, who made the land and the sea. Oh, and everything in between as well. You remember from last week that when the storm started out, they all started praying themselves, but they didn't pray to Yahweh God. They prayed to their own local gods. It was not unusual for every area of the Mediterranean. Wherever you live, you had your own God. And so they were praying to their own various gods, just hoping one of them would answer them. And then Jonah steps up, describes his God, right? And they figure out, well, this is the God that we're dealing with right now. It's interesting, before, it had been none of their business that Jonah was running from his God. These sailors had probably gone on lots of adventures and had lots of things said to them and had lots of stories to tell. It may not have been unusual for someone to say, I'm trying to get away from my God. But before this, it had been none of their business that this was what was happening. Now they are forced to deal in the reality that existed between Jonah and his God. They were basically forced into his story because his story was unfolding right before them. Right? So they feared the storm, but they feared a great fear in regards to the Lord. Now this, the fear of the Lord, Proverbs 1:7 says this, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. That first phrase, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, or the beginning of wisdom. This comes into play in our text this morning. The very first thing that happens is that this fear comes upon them, and they start learning how to deal with the God of the universe, right? We find, indeed, this is the beginning of knowledge for these sailors. And they ask him, what have you done? What have you done, Jonah, that you've brought this upon us, that you've brought this storm upon us? And when they say that phrase, what have you done, I'm thinking in Jonah's mind, he's thinking back to a couple characters that he knows. He's thinking back to Eve in the Garden of Eden. That's what God said to Eve. What is this you have done? When she ate the fruit, that God said, eat anything you want except for this, right? Just don't eat this. You can eat this, this, this. Don't eat this. And then she ate that. And he says, what have you done? It's also what God says to Cain, right? When Cain killed his brother Abel, he looks at Cain and says, what have you done? Now, Jonah stands up before these sailors and they use the same words. What is it that you have done? And he recognizes the place that he is now occupying in relation to God. Verse 11, the sea, it was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, the sailors asked Jonah, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you. So the sea is starting to press the issue. They've floundered back and forth for a while, but now they're to the point where they've got to do something or their ship's going to break apart. It's getting worse and worse. It's time to do something, right? And I want to take just a second, again, to talk about the literary beauty of this book. The second question they ask him, there are a set of questions here, and the questions move from, what have you done? Now it's, what will we do, right? What have you done? What will we do? And Jonah went from being the object, what have you done, to now being the direct object. What shall we do with you? So it's what have you done? Now what shall we do with you? And it's kind of going back and forth and back and forth. And really, it's not unlike the waves of the ocean going from one side to the other and back, right? And I think the author's kind of almost making the words flow back and forth, like the waves are flowing back and forth, and the ship is being tossed back and forth. And they say, what is this you have done? And Jonah says, this is what you need to do. You need to throw me in. He literally says, hurl me in. That's the same word that was used at the beginning of verse 4 to talk about how God hurled this storm at them. Now he says, you need to hurl me into the sea. Hurl me into the sea. So as he says this, we ask ourselves, what is his motivation here? I can imagine a couple different things going through his mind. Do we view Jonah as being penitent, as saying, listen, I know I've done wrong. I got to pay the piper, right? This is what needs to happen. Is he being maybe not penitent? Is he being sacrificial? He does say, because of me, this is why these things have come upon you. So he's at least starting to recognize that his actions affect other people. That's a good first step. Maybe he's being sacrificial. Maybe he's being noble, right? I'll step up and take this for the team. He might be suicidal, right? Some people have even posited that. To me, this is where I come down on this. I think that Jonah is at the place where he expects to die, right? He expects that this is it. I imagine he's never seen a storm like this either, right? And he's probably scared out of his mind, and he expects to die, and to die under the judgment of God. It's almost a resignation. This is the mess I'm in. This is where I'm going to stay. Just throw me overboard, right? In fact, he's almost trying to force that to happen. Death would come as a relief, right? But you can't manipulate God as much as you may try. So Jonah says, throw me overboard. Verse 13, though, says, instead, the men, the sailors, they did their best to row back to land. But they couldn't, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, don't let us die for taking this man's life. Don't hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. The thought of doing what Jonah suggests is more frightening to these sailors than the sea even, right? Throw an innocent man overboard, or at least innocent in their eyes, right? They can't fathom doing that, so they try to turn back themselves. And by the way, that word turn back, one of the things the author of Jonah likes to do is to reuse words. You've seen that already in just our first few weeks here. This word to turn back, it's the same word that he'll use when Nineveh does repent, right? They turn back like a boat turns around, and it's the same word that the book of Jonah uses to talk about what happens to God's wrath, that God's wrath turned away from the Ninevites because they themselves had turned back. So now the sailors, they're trying to do this, but they're trying to do it by themselves. They say, we're gonna row back to shore. I don't know how far out they were. I don't know how far they had to go. But they said, we're going to row back. So they get out their oars and they row back. And literally that verb row, it means, the word here used is an unusual word for sailing. It says they try to dig their way back, right? You ever try to dig your way out of a hole? What happens when you try to dig your way out of a hole? The hole just gets deeper and deeper. And so they're rowing and they're rowing and they're rowing. And it says they couldn't get back. And it's not that it doesn't say and they failed in their attempt, right? It doesn't say they tried, but they just didn't make it. Maybe a better attempt might work later on. It says they couldn't. It was a complete inability, right? No matter how hard they tried, no matter what technique they used, they were not going to row back to shore against this storm. They couldn't do it. And man, this is a whole lesson in itself. I could preach a whole lesson on this one idea of this picture of trying to row against the storm and rowing with all your might and recognizing that you're not getting anywhere. This is something that's so easy for us to get wrong. How many times do we find ourselves trying to do something that we have no ability to accomplish? Not that we're just bad at it. Not that we're not trying the right way or trying hard enough. We just can't do it. But we still take it upon ourselves to try to do things that really are things that only God can do. How often do we find ourselves trying to replace God with something else, oftentimes with our own efforts? Right? How many people think that the ability to harbor themselves in safety is something they can accomplish if they could just row hard, just row a little harder? I'll get up tomorrow, I'm going to row harder. And it didn't work today, but maybe tomorrow I'll try rowing a different way. I'm just going to keep rowing and rowing, and one of these days I'm going to do this. But there are things in life that we can't do on our own that God has to do for us. Have you ever experienced this in your spiritual life? Right? In your spiritual life, is there an area in your spiritual life in which you have toiled and toiled to try and gain some ground, only to find that you are right back where you started? Right? You've maybe even gone backwards a little bit, right? And that can feel so completely frustrating and defeating. God, I've been trying. I know this is what you want me to do, or I know this is what you want me to not do. I've been trying and trying, and I'm still in the same place, right? For a long time. But think about this. If God had allowed these sailors to row back to the shores of Joppa, what happens to the sailors? What happens to these sailors if God allows them to row back through this storm? Probably they get back, they start telling these stories. Maybe they're regarded as heroes, right? People buy them drinks and say, oh, you're great. They might get some stories told about them, but by and large, they'll go back to their old lives. But because God lets them wear themselves out, rowing and rowing and rowing, what happens to them? Where do they go? The answer is not nowhere, right? You might think, well, they're rowing and rowing and rowing and are in the same place. Where did they go? They went nowhere. The answer is not they went nowhere. The answer is they went to God. They went to God. Verse 14, this is the first prayer to Yahweh, to God, uttered in the book of Jonah. And whose mouth does it come out of? It comes out of the mouths of Gentiles, right? People who do not fear God, people who don't really know who Yahweh God is. This first prayer in the book of Jonah comes out of their mouths. And notice how different this round of prayers is than the first round, right? This is not just babbling to some small God, personal God who they think might be able to help them. If we can just push the right button, maybe God will help us. This is not that kind of prayer. They are addressing Yahweh, the God of Israel, who created the sea, who created dry land, who lives in heaven. Here's something to remember as we look at this story of Jonah. We can look at it through different sets of eyes. We can look at it through Jonah's eyes. We can look at it through the sailor's eyes. We can kind of step back and look at it from our own perspective. For the people in this story, for Jonah and the sailors, what they don't know is that things are much better off than they seem. I can't imagine that they're looking around and being able to see anything good that's going on at that very moment. Right? They look around and all they see is wind and lightning and thunder, maybe hail and wind, and waves and salt water in their eyes. That's all that they're experiencing, and it seems really bad. But because we've got some perspective, we can see that things really are much better off than they seem. In fact, something really good is happening here. Something really good is happening. What they don't know and what they will find out is that what God desired for these sailors was not their destruction, but their salvation. Right? God wanted them to turn to Him. He didn't want to destroy them. That's probably what they thought at this moment. There's just this God who's obviously very powerful, and He's sending the storm. He must want to crush us. God does not want to crush them. He wants them to turn and know Him. Verse 15. Then they took Jonah, because they had no other choice, and they threw him overboard. They hurled him overboard, just like they had done with the cargo. And the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows to him. First question might be, why doesn't Jonah just jump in? Right? He says, you guys need to throw me in. They don't throw him in. They try rowing back. Why didn't Jonah just jump in the water? Right? Why didn't he throw himself in? It's because that doesn't complete the picture that Jonah needs to complete. Jonah doesn't know that. I don't think Jonah knows why he doesn't jump in. We know why Jonah doesn't jump in. Because Jonah needs to be handed over to others to be thrown into the sea. Why does that need to happen? Because what we see all throughout the book of Jonah is that Jonah is a very rough sketch of Jesus. What I mean by that is Jonah gives this kind of blurry, slightly off-centered, kind of messy view of who Jesus would eventually be. Right? We see so much of Jesus in Jonah, but it's not a good, clear picture. Right? And a lot of it's by accident. Jonah doesn't even know. Right? But because at this moment of his most desperate, that he finds himself to be the most Christ-like, because this is exactly what Jesus does. Jesus hands himself to others to be sacrificed so that everyone else can be saved. That's what Jonah does here. It's a picture, it's a bad, off-centered picture of what Jesus will come and do in sharply and in great detail later on. Right? This is who Jesus will eventually be, but much, much better. Right? He has turned himself over for the lives of others. And the results are immediate. Right? He throws them in, and now the seas are calm, the winds die down. I imagine the sun comes up. And again, they feared a great fear. Same phrase at the beginning. Now, if you remember, I talked about this Hebrew word yareh. It means fear. Y-A-R-A-E is how we would transliterate it. But yareh. And that word can mean two different kinds of fear. It can mean the terror kind of fear, like I'm scared something bad's going to happen. Or it can be the reverential, awe-inspiring fear. This is the reverent fear. And it wasn't just a small fear. They feared a great fear. They revered the Lord. They stood in awe of him. Now that the storm is over, now that they could feel the sun warming their faces, now that they see where they have landed, where they are, right? Now they have this reverential fear for God. And they acknowledge the power of God, and they worshiped him. Right? They worshiped him. When God's wrath relents, worship happens. Right? Some of the greatest psalms in the book of Psalms are written after the psalmist has done something really dumb and bad and stupid, something sinful, right? And they encounter the mercy of God, and they're so struck by God's mercy and his grace that worship just spouts out of them, right? God, I don't deserve this. You were so good to me. I just got to worship you, right? God reveals himself and responds to their needs, and they worship. Worship is the natural response of God's grace and mercy. Psalm 66. The psalmist writes, I will come to your temple with burnt offerings and fulfill my vows to you. Vows my lips promised and my mouth spoke when I was in trouble. I will sacrifice fat animals to you, and an offering of rams. I will offer bulls and goats. Come and hear. This is my favorite part. Come and hear, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what he has done for me. That's worship. When we tell the world, even when we tell God back, this is what you have done for me. That's what worship is about. When we recognize all that God has done for us, and we make it known to others. A few things, just real quick. Some things that, as I read this text, some truths that I think would be beneficial for all of us. One thing I want to point out is that Jonah, the disobedient prophet, is doing his best preaching right now in his disobedience. Isn't that interesting? That Jonah's disobedience actually turns into preaching. All right? When God deals with Jonah's guilt, it's a revelation of who God is. The sailors see this interaction. They see this prophet who is not doing what he's supposed to do. He says, I'm running away from God. He sees the interaction, and it turns into worship for them. Right? Jonah's doing his best preaching right now. What could Jonah have said to them to convince them of the power of his God? He could have gotten on board and bragged about God, right? I serve Yahweh, the God who created the land and the sea, and he's great and he's wonderful and he does these good things. And what would they have done? They would have said, oh, that's nice. We've got our gods too, and gone about their business. In fact, that is kind of what happened, right? But it was only Jonah's brazen guilt and God's response to it that convinced the sailors of who God is. That's what convinced them. Now, we typically want to confine our witness for God with some kind of message that talks about what good people we are, right? But that's not always the truth. Sometimes our best witnesses, even when we talk about the times when we failed. Now, I'm not saying, so what you should do is all go out and disobey God, and then everybody will see who God is. That's not obviously the lesson here. But what we see is God's ability to use even our disobedience in his purposes. Secondly, we see that this is an area in which Jonah is in his position on the boat because he's been chosen by God. We put a lot of effort into establishing a meritocracy. What I mean by meritocracy is that you are treated on the basis of your merits, right? You do something good, good things happen. You do something bad, bad things happen. Basically, you get kind of what you deserve, right? What could be more fair than that? That's the kind of world we want to live in. You work hard, study, do whatever, then good things happen. But God chooses people despite their weaknesses and failures. Deuteronomy chapter 7. This is God talking to Israel. And he says to them something interesting. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. And they're all feeling, this is nice. God's saying good, nice things about us. He's chosen us. We're his special possession. We're treasure. But then it says, the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you are more numerous than other peoples, for you are the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to you, to your ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. I didn't choose you because you were better. I didn't choose you because you were smarter or better looking or any of these things. I chose you just because I love you, right? This is based on my love. And that leads to the third thing. The vocation of the chosen is to be the rejected, the one who is sacrificed. We see this truth in Jonah. Last week, the sailors cast lots to see which one of the people on board was responsible for what was happening. And it said the lot fell to Jonah. And I talked about this last week, how that was a mirror image of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament, when they would take two goats, one on this side, one on this side, that were essentially identical. They were spot-free. They were healthy. They were essentially considered pure enough to be sacrificed to God. And they would cast lots, throw dice, basically. One of them gets to go off in the wilderness, and the other one they sacrifice. And how the one who actually won the game of lots was the one who was sacrificed. You would think the guy that got to go free won, but the one that was chosen was the one who was sacrificed. Here we see it happening all over with Jonah, right? God chose Jonah from among all the sailors, from among all the people on board. Says, you are the one that I've chosen, and he's the one thrown overboard, right? The vocation of the chosen is to be rejected. What a lesson to Israel, God's chosen people, that their purpose in being chosen was to be sacrificial. This gives us a new identity as those who have been chosen by God as well, because we now Disciples of Jesus are God's chosen people. But we've been chosen for the reason of being sacrificial. Those chosen by God aren't chosen solely for a life of comfort and exaltation. They're chosen for a life of service and of sacrifice. Sometimes even service and sacrifice for those who will make nothing of it. Think about that. When you've been chosen by God, you've been chosen now to live a life of service and sacrifice, sometimes even for people that don't deserve it and won't appreciate it. You say, well, that sounds a little extreme, Rob, right? Isn't that a little extreme? Well, let's look at the life of Jesus. Can we say that Jesus was chosen for this very reason? To serve and sacrifice himself on behalf of people who didn't deserve it? And in fact, many of those who would not appreciate it? Yeah. And how about Jesus' instructions for our lives? Does he not say, whoever wants to be my disciple must take up their what? Their cross and follow me. What is the cross if it's not a symbol of sacrifice? Right? They must take up their cross and follow me. The very service of sacrifice and service. And look at this scene from the book of Revelation, in which Jesus, the slaughtered lamb, sits on the heavenly throne. Revelation chapter 5, verse 11. This is John's vision of heaven. And you got this lamb sitting on the throne. It's Jesus. It says, then I looked and I heard the voice of many angels. Picture this in your mind. Many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands, and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. In a loud voice, this is what they were saying. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise. It was Jesus' sacrificial action that makes him worthy to sit on the throne. So now, when we wake up in the morning, what do we think? We think, today is a day that I go out and I live a life of service and sacrifice to others, because that is the life of those who have been chosen by God. Don't mistake your role as one of God's chosen people as a first-class ticket through life. When you come up out of these baptismal waters, don't just recognize yourself as one who has been saved and is bound for the glories of heaven. That is true. But we need to recognize ourselves as ones who are now marked and committed to a life of sacrifice and service. Let's pray. God, what we see in Jonah is ultimately what we see in all Scripture, and that is Jesus, your perfect Son, who from the very beginning was the plan for salvation. He's the one who can deliver us from the storm, despite the failure of our own rowing, the failure of our own attempts at getting ourselves out of our sin, out of our shame, out of our sorrow. Your Son Jesus is the only one who can do that for us. And God, your Son Jesus was the one who showed us the same thing that Jonah showed us, that you choose us to, yes, eventually reward us and exalt us and give us salvation in heaven, but that at present we are called to live lives of sacrifice and service. And though Jonah's motivation may not have been the most pure, his actions showed exactly what you needed them to show. Being handed over to others, being thrown overboard, being sacrificed is a beautiful, beautiful picture of what your Son Jesus has done for us. And Lord, that is why we respond. As we look around us and realize the storms of our lives that you've rescued us from and that you will continue to rescue us from, may that result in our praise and worship as it did with these sailors. We pray it in Jesus' name.